Okay, let's jump right in. Have you been watching the US dollar this year? Because something pretty dramatic has been happening. It's been in a free fall, and honestly, the story behind why is way more fascinating than you might think.
So that's the big question, right? What on earth is going on? Why is the world's go-to benchmark currency suddenly taking such a nosedive? We're going to unpack that mystery.
And when I say nosedive, I am not kidding. The US dollar index has dropped over 10% this year. Now, for a stock, a 10% move is just another Tuesday. But for the currency that underpins the entire global financial system, that is a massive earthquake. It was actually the dollar's worst performance in almost half a century. But here's where it gets really weird. It's not just that the dollar fell, it's how it fell. It started acting, well, erratically. It's like it completely forgot how it was supposed to behave, breaking all these long-standing rules of finance. You see, for years, the dollar, stocks, and bonds were this tight-knit group. They moved together. But then, right around May, something just snapped. You could see it on the charts. Stocks took off like a rocket, but the dollar, it went the other way. They basically broke up. And to understand why, we need to look at three big forces that were at play. So let's start with force number one, which is probably the biggest driver this year, and that is the risk factor, but with a very interesting twist. Think about it. For decades, whenever there's chaos in the world, what do investors do? They run to the US dollar. It's the ultimate safe place to hide. But this year, with all the tariff policies coming out of the Trump administration, the market had this crazy realization. The safe haven was now the source of the risk. The very thing you're supposed to run to for safety was now the thing people were running from. And that new risk factor, it perfectly explains those two breakups we saw. With stocks, investors all over the world still wanted in on the booming US stock market, but they did not want the risk that came with holding the US dollar itself. And with bonds, it was a slightly different fear. People started getting nervous about the US government's long-term credit risk, its ability to actually pay back its debts. Okay, but hold on. You're probably thinking, if all this foreign money is pouring into US stocks like Nvidia, don't they have to buy US dollars first? Shouldn't that make the dollar go up? And you know what? Logically, you're absolutely right. But they found a very clever workaround. And that workaround has a name: currency hedging. It's a fancy term for a pretty simple idea. It's a strategy that lets you invest in a country's assets, like its stocks, without having to worry about its currency tanking and wiping out your profits. It's like buying insurance. It's actually a pretty simple three-step dance. So step one, a foreign investor swaps their home currency for US dollars. Step two, they use those dollars to buy the US stock they want. Let's say it's Nvidia. But here, and this is the secret sauce, is step three. At the very same moment, they make a side bet that the US dollar is going to fall. So they get all the upside from the stock, but they're protected from the downside of the currency. Pretty smart, right? And the result of this strategy has been, well, a complete 180. In the past, more than 80% of foreign money coming into US stocks was unhedged. People were happy to own dollars. This year, it is completely flipped. Now, over 80% of that money is hedged. That means investors are still buying American companies, but they are actively betting against the American dollar. So if the Trump risk factor was the story of the first half of the year, the second half really belongs to force number two, the Federal Reserve and its big pivot. The best way to get what the Fed is thinking is with an analogy. So picture the Fed as a teacher. This teacher has two main goals for their class. First, get good grades. That's like keeping inflation stable. And second, make sure the students are healthy. That's like having maximum employment. But the teacher only has one tool to manage both: the amount of homework they assign. And that homework is interest rates. Now, for the past year, the grades, inflation, have been okay, hanging around 3%. Not an A+, but not failing. So our teacher, the Fed, has turned all of its attention to student health, the employment numbers. They're basically just watching the job market for any sign of weakness, and that will be their signal that it's time to reduce the homework, or in other words, to start cutting interest rates. But this intense focus on data brings us to our third and final force, and this is where things start to get pretty messy. We're talking about political pressure and the very data the Fed is relying on. You see, the problem is that the key data the Fed is watching so closely has become unbelievably unreliable. Just look at the monthly jobs report. In May, the initial number said the economy added 139,000 jobs. Great, but the final, revised number, just 19,000. Then in June, it went from a gain of 147,000 jobs to a final revision showing a loss of 13,000. I mean, these aren't just little tweaks, these are gigantic market-moving corrections.
And this kind of volatility led to a pretty furious reaction from then-President Trump. He straight up accused the Bureau of manipulating the data to embarrass him and ended up firing the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. It was part of a much bigger campaign to influence the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be completely independent. It included things like trying to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook and, maybe most importantly, successfully getting a close political ally, Kevin Mirren, appointed to the Fed's board. And you could see the effect almost immediately. This here is the Fed's dot plot. Each one of those dots is a board member's prediction for where interest rates are headed. But look, do you see that one dot? Way down at the bottom? It's a huge outlier, predicting much deeper, faster rate cuts than anyone else. And the strong implication is that this is the new appointee, bringing that political pressure right inside the room where decisions are made. So what a mess, right? You've got the dollar getting hit by this new kind of risk, being steered by a Fed that's depending on shaky data, all while being leaned on by politicians. So where does it go from here? Well, the outlook is not exactly bright. You've got other big central banks, like in Europe and Japan, who are getting ready to tighten their own policies. That's going to put even more downward pressure on the dollar. In fact, analysts at Morgan Stanley think it could fall another 10% from here. Which brings me to one last really important point about data. What if I told you that this year there was a financial index that had an incredible 82.4% correlation with the S&P 500? I mean, think about that. What could it be? Some secret measure of global money supply? A super obscure economic indicator that only a few people know about? What could possibly track the world's most important stock market with that kind of crazy accuracy? The answer is my fan count. Yeah, I'm just kidding. But our source uses this to make a brilliant point. Data can fool you. Just because two things move together doesn't mean one is causing the other. It's a powerful reminder that correlation is not causation. You have to look at the why behind the numbers, the risk, the policy shifts, the politics, because that's what tells the real story. So, the big takeaway here, always look deeper.